my mandates. In Latin, that's mandates. The things that have been instituted. Keep the things that have been instituted and do them. Keep going.
And you shall not profane my holy name, that I may be sanctified among the people of Israel.
Just stop there. There's a purpose clause. Keep my mandates and do them so that you do not profane or desecrate my holy name. Keep going.
That I may be sanctified among the people of Israel. I am the Lord who sanctifies you, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord.
Okay. Notice the reference to the holy name there. The two things come together. The most holy sanctifying mandates and the sanctifying name are the means by which God communicates his holiness, are the means by which the Israelites participate in God's holiness. Now, that's where the emphasis lies in the New Testament. Hallowed be thy name. Which name? Father. Sanctify us in the truth. Your word is truth. Everything is consecrated by the word of God and prayer. And for us, the most holy anointing oil is the word. No. The Spirit. The Messiah is not anointed with the olive oil, but is anointed with the Holy Spirit. The new most holy anointing oil that makes prophets, priests and kings. Okay, very important for this is, on the one hand, God initially ordains, consecrates Israel for its mission, its vocation here on earth. Its vocation is to be a holy, priestly people. But holiness, as I said to you, is not a gift you possess, it's an emanating gift. A gift that you need to receive over and over again. You can't have holiness apart from a holy God. You can't have, just as you can't have love apart from a lover. Just as you can't have light apart from the sun, so you can't have holiness apart from God. And that means that if you are to participate in God's holiness, you need to be in touch with God. And that is what is given by God in the divine service and by his word and his most holy name. Any questions on that very, very important topic? Yeah.
Is there any credence to 31, 32, and 33 of Leviticus there, that it would be like a 3-2-1 approach from the third commandment, second commandment, first commandment?
Yes, indeed.
So we run 1, 2, 3, and then he kind of reverses it.
Yes, it's reverse order. Yeah. And notice the repetition, there's a threefold repetition which emphasizes this, I am the Lord. Whenever the Israelites are partaking in the divine service, God through the priest introduces himself and says, I am the Lord. Notice the emphasis there on the holy name. The holy name, the holy name, 3 times. I think, if my memory is right, some of the patristic commentators take this passage as the threefold, I am the Lord, as referring to the 3 persons of the Trinity. It's a bit fanciful, but you can see how they get there. Any other questions? Okay. Now, we've had a look at number 5, the institution of the altar. Remember, it comes immediately after the 10 Commandments. The first thing that God gives Moses to give to the people is the altar. And if it's the first thing, what does it indicate?
Most important.
It's the most important. All the rest can only be in place if you have the altar. The altar comes first, because that's the bridgehead between heaven and earth, God and his people. I'd just like to summarise this. I assume you know it, or shall we read it again? No, maybe we better read it again. Joel, can you read Exodus 20, 22 to 24? I better not assume that you have this in your mind. Exodus 20, 22 to 24. (22 to 24).
This only goes to 23 in my translations.
Okay, well, what about you, Tim? Tim, isn't it? Yes.
You got it, 22. And the Lord said to Moses, "Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, you have seen that I have talked with you from heaven. You shall not make anything to be with me, gods of silver or gods of gold you shall not make for yourselves. An altar," 24?
Yes.
"An altar of earth you shall make for me, and you shall sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen, in every place where I record my name, I will come to you, and I will bless you."
Wherever I cause my name to be remembered has two senses. Wherever I introduce myself by name, that's the place where you may build an altar for me. But the reverse is also true. Where I have not chosen a place and introduced myself by name, there you may not build an altar. So the only places we are allowed to build an altar is a place where God has appeared in theophany to his people and has introduced himself by name. Now that then sets a precedent, since God has appeared there and spoken his name to them, therefore they can use that name to remember God. So wherever I allow you to remember my name or to use my name to address me, there I will come and bless you. Double sense, and both of those are clearly implied here. Okay, just to summarise this. Now, there's a very common misunderstanding of the function of the altar in the Old Testament and elsewhere. And you can see it almost, you can hear it in every second sermon that will talk about the altar. Most Christians believe that the altar is the place of sacrifice. That is a load of bunk. Altars were not places where you slaughtered the animal. The slaughter of the animal has very little in the Old Testament ritual significance. Now, sometimes pagan people used altars to slaughter animals. Not always, not exclusively, but pagan people used altars to slaughter animals. Now, the slaughter of the animals occurs elsewhere. The altar is not the place of slaughter. And so you get the thing of Jesus being offered on the altar of the cross. Brings the wrong picture to people. Okay? Well, if it's not the place of slaughter, what is it then? It's the place not to slaughter animals, but it's the place where you present offerings to God. Whether they are offerings of from animals, or whether they're offerings of incense, whether they're offerings of wine, whether they're offerings of grain or bread. It's the place to present offerings to God. And secondly, it's the place where you receive, it's the table where you receive holy food from God. Now, pagan altars were very often placed before the idols of the gods. They were understood to be tables in which you offered food to the gods. Now, in Israel, it's reversed. You bring the offerings to God not as food for God, but as food to be sanctified by God's presence, so that God could provide you with most holy food. The rest there I've already covered. That's the most important thing that I need to add to what I've already said. Yes, Bob?
So in the reading in chapel this morning where it talked about the food of God, it's not talking about the food that he eats, but the food he provides.
The food that he provides. So it's not, it actually is bread. The bread from heaven is not, the bread of heaven is not the bread that we bring to heaven, it's the bread that comes from heaven for us here on earth. So it's not the food for God. that for God to eat, but it's the food which belongs to God, which is given to the priests and given to the people. Any other questions? Okay, now how's time going? I've got half an hour to begin what's a very interesting and important topic, which is the institution of the tabernacle. Okay, now, after chapter 20, we come to chapter 21. The first thing that God institutes for the divine service is the place of service, and the place of service is the tabernacle. Okay, now, just can I point out to you a lovely little contrast. In the beginning of the book of Exodus, Pharaoh enslaved the Israelites to do what?
Serve him.
And by doing what? Build what?
Bricks.
For what?
Temple.
Not for temples. Well, there would have been temples there, and it's not even pyramids, no.
4 cities. 2 cities.
2 cities. So they were enslaved to be for Pharaoh, to help to build cities for Pharaoh. Cities, and there would have been temples there, that's part of it. They were holy cities, those 2 cities that I mentioned. Now, God frees them from slavery and the task of city building in order for them to do what? Tabernacle building, temple building for him. So you get from city building for Pharaoh, tabernacle building for the Lord. Let me take you through the basic part of this. I should be able to get through this before lunch. I don't want to rush it. Most of it, I think, is fairly accessible. Okay, the tabernacle was instituted first in the speeches, the 7 speeches that God gave to Moses on Mount Sinai. Okay, now notice that there's 7 speeches. They correspond to the 7 days of creation. Just as God created the world, no, that's not the emphasis. The emphasis is just as God ordered the world in 7 days, so God orders his sanctuary in 7 speeches. Right? So, and it's through his word that he orders creation, through his word that he orders the worship of Israel and the place of worship. Yes?
I've seen some places where the tabernacle is given cosmological.
Yes.
It's seen as a symbol of the cosmos.
Yes.
Is there any foundation for that in the Old Testament?
There are hints of it. It's developed at great length in Josephus, Philo, and in the later Jewish tradition. The temple is a microcosm of the cosmos. But not of the cosmos, the natural order. It's a microcosm of the sanctified cosmos. Provided you go that way, yes. Just as the priest's vestments are a microcosm, if you like, they are stylized, connected with the tabernacle. So the priest's vestments are a microcosm of the order of the tabernacle. There's lots of patternings of this. Now, which is the work? There's a number of works. If you look at the work of John Levinson, I just don't recall his title, but Levinson, Jewish scholar, he develops this quite cogently, if you're interested in following it further. John Levinson? Oh, the title will come to me, yes. Now, there are hints of this, but the accent's not here. But you can see that with this patterning, 7 days of creation, 7 days of tabernacle building, there is a parallel between the two, and there's a connection implied between the two. It is implied. You can't find a correspondence between the 7 speeches exactly and the 7 days of creation. The only place where you can find it is the last day of the ordering of the cosmos and the last day of the institution of the divine service end up in the Sabbath. Now, so you get the tabernacle instituted in the first of the 7 speeches. It was the account of its construction is in chapter 36 following. So that's the building of all the bits and pieces, and the actually setting up of the tabernacle is done by Moses, and the account of that is in chapter 41 to 33. Now, there's some hints of the connection between the tabernacle building and world building at the very end of the account of its construction. Joel, can you look up 2 passages? Oh, no, you had... Or see if you can find this. Chapter 39, verse 43. Chapter 39, verse 43. Just read 42 beforehand, and then I'm interested in 43, and see if you can... something strikes you in the light of Genesis 1 and 2.
Just as the Lord had commanded Moses, so the Israelites had done all the work. And when Moses saw that they had performed all the tasks, as the Lord had commanded, so they had done, Moses blessed them.
What's the allusion here to Genesis 1 and 2? Remember that the end of creation, God He saw that it was good. And God also blessed. But you get a new blessing here, not from God, but from Moses, from God through Moses, just as God blessed fish and birds, animals and man. Now, through Moses, He blesses who? What? The people who make the tabernacle. Now go to the next chapter and you get an even clearer allusion to it. Verse 33.
And he set up the enclosure around the tabernacle and the altar and put up the screen for the gate of enclosure. And when Moses had finished the work, the cloud covered...
Yes, no, that's right. When Moses did what? Had finished the work. There's a couple of other places which talk about the fact that Moses finished the work. Exactly the same verb as in Genesis 2, those opening 1 to 3. So that's if you like to see the parallel here. There are hints of the connection between the two. And the importance is not so much the microcosm, macrocosm stuff, but has to do with order. God creates order, first of all, in the world, natural order in the world. It's an ordered world. Now after that, he institutes ordered worship for Israel. The first has to do with God's administration of blessing to all people here on earth. The second order is the order of sanctification, the means by which God blesses His people with His holiness. He communicates His holiness to His people through the tabernacle and the divine service that's performed at the tabernacle. Now, if you're going to make sense of the tabernacle, you won't be able to make sense of it just by looking at the text, unless you can actually picture it. And so can you look very closely at the diagram of the arrangement of the tabernacle? And I want to point out some important features. Now, in everything that follows, you need to have this picture in mind. Okay, notice first of all that the whole tabernacle precincts consists of 2 perfect cubes, or better, squares. Can you see? 2 squares? There. And there's only one entrance to those 2 squares. Where do you find the entrance? On the east side. So the basic access is from east to west. Now take notice of that. The question of orientation, which has been very important for church architecture. However, that orientation is not what you'd expect coming from temples in the ancient world. Just think of it, as you come to the temple or the tabernacle, your back is towards the east, therefore your back is towards the sun. It's deliberately opposed to any form of sun worship. Remember in the time of Ezekiel, people went the other way around. They turned and faced not the west, but they turned to face the rising sun in the east, in the temple. Okay, so you have an east-west axis, but you face the west, not the east. Which means that you don't face the origin of time, the origin of the world, but you face the goal of the creation too. Not the sun, but the one who brings the sun to its goal. Thirdly, so you get the outer court, inner court. Notice the two focal points there. What's the focal point of the outer court? Is the altar for burnt offering. You come there, what's the first thing you see? Is the altar for burnt offering. And what's the focal point of the inner court? The Ark of the Covenant, the throne of God in the Holy of Holies. And the Holy of Holies is a perfect cube. Notice if you're interested in numbers, there's a whole complex number symbolism here, which you can work out for yourself. There's mathematical perfection, which is used here as a symbol of the perfection of God's holiness. Now, the next thing, notice the laver, the wash bath, stands between the altar and the entrance to the shrine, the holy place. That location's significant because before a priest can enter the holy place, or before a priest can come out of the holy place and mount the altar, they need to wash their hands and feet at the most holy laver. That's a very holy thing there. Then notice the furniture in the shrine, the holy place. The most important thing is the altar for incense, which is in front of the curtain. Now the curtain is not a single curtain, but it is a double-layered curtain. So the priest doesn't push the curtain aside to go in on the Day of Atonement, but he goes by way of a most holy way. Here's the altar for incense. He goes here, and then comes here, and then turns and faces the mercy seat. Now this is important if you're going to understand the book of Hebrews. The way, the most holy way, the holy way into the Holy of Holies. This is the way. It's the way through the curtain. And that was arranged in such a way that no light was ever let into the most holy of holy places. Okay? So it's a double-layered curtain. Okay, now to explain the significance of this most holy structure, basically there are three zones. There are three zones here to the tabernacle and its precincts, and they correspond to the three zones at Mount Sinai. Remember at Mount Sinai you have the foot of the mountain where the people assemble. That's where the altar is. Then you have the cloud-covered mountain. Who's allowed to go on the cloud-covered mountain? Moses and the priests. The 70 elders just once. That's not a regular thing, but the priests have open access to the cloud-covered part of the mountain. And then you have the top of the mountain, the tip of the mountain, where only Moses can go. Okay? The tabernacle is a mobile Mount Sinai. Or if you like to put it another way, Mount Sinai prefigures the tabernacle, which prefigures the temple, and itself is a copy of the heavenly temple. let me take you through those 3 zones. And have you got those 3 zones? So the tabernacle is a mobile Mount Sinai. I love that. That's a very nice summary of it. Okay, let's start from the inside and go out. The Holy of Holies is God's private quarters. If you like, it's his bedroom. And there you have a throne which is made up of 3 components. There is the atonement cover, or the mercy seat. Hebrews calls it the throne of grace. So you have the seat of a throne. That's most significant because that's the focus of the ritual on the Day of Atonement. Then on that seat you have the cherubim. They form the back and the sides of the throne. And then you have the Ark of the Covenant with the 10 Commandments, the 2 tablets, and a jar of manna, which is the basis of the throne. Okay, that's the seat. This is the bottom of the throne. So if you look side one, you have a seat here. You have the Ark of the Covenant under the seat. And then you have the cherubim that form the back and the sides of the seat. Now the seat itself is a throne, so you get royal imagery. God is enthroned upon the cherubim. Okay? That's where it comes from. He is Yahweh of the cherubim, referring primarily to this. Now, what is funny about this throne? If you actually went in there and could pull the curtains aside, what's odd about this throne? It's an empty throne. It's an empty throne from a human point of view because God is enthroned here, and it's God who is invisible, who is invisibly enthroned, with his glory hidden in a cloud of, the cloud, so the glory cloud. This is the place of God's presence. This is where he sits. This is where he resides. Now, this is the inaccessible place. No one goes there except the high priest on the Day of Atonement. And even when he goes there, he goes several times in, but the first time he goes in, he has a very powerful form of smoke, incense that produces a really dark cloud of smoke, and he puts that incense on a pan of coals, and as he walks then, he puts the coals and the incense on the coals as he starts walking here, and he goes, what's he doing?
Smoking in front of him.
He's smoking in front of him. What's the practical purpose of that smoke? He can't see anything. It's to, just in case there is a little bit of light there, that light is removed by the smoke that precedes him. So it's total darkness, absolute darkness. Well, how did the priest know where to go? We have evidence only from the Mishnah, late text, and it's probably very, very ancient. The Mishnah tells us that for the week before the Day of Atonement, the priest would practice this ritual. And he practiced the ritual blindfolded. And it would be marked out. The whole dimensions of it would be marked out beforehand. I won't take you through the whole ritual of the Day of Atonement. That's Leviticus. You can look at my commentary. But the priest would go and he would practice then. And he'd practice steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And he'd do it so that each step was exactly right. If he was done over and over again so that he would get it exactly right. Okay, step this way, and then at this point, take however many steps he needed to do forward, and do a right-hand turn, so and so many steps until he was exactly the place before the mercy seat. He had to sprinkle some blood on the seat, but most of the blood was sprinkled 7 times on the ground, the floor of the Holy of Holies. So it's totally dark, had to practice it. According to the Mishnah, the high priest, at least at the time of the Second Temple, had a rope that was attached to his ankles as he did this. Do you know why?
Yes. In case he died, they could pull him out.
Yes, and there are some stories, you have stories of priests who had a heart attack or who God punished for some reason. And if a person dies then in that most holy place, wow, nobody would be game to go in and retrieve the body. So they dragged the poor blighter out by the rope. That's how seriously they took it. So this is God's private quarters. Now, if this was a pagan, if this tabernacle was a pagan shrine, what would be different about this? There'd be an idol here. And the idol would most likely be on a throne. But, what? You wouldn't have a curtain. You wouldn't have the veil. In some rites, priests alone were allowed to approach, but people could see the idol. Because what's the point of having an idol if you can't see it? So the important thing is, even if only the priest could actually go here, which was seldom the case, the people could see the idol and people could approach the idol even if they weren't allowed to touch the idol. Notice how then, so this is counter-cultural, counter-religious. Here you have, if you like, an idol that's an anti-idol. And the emphasis is on to remove the element of sight whatsoever. You see nothing. Absolutely zilch. Remember, in the end, immediately after the giving of the Ten Commandments, Moses goes up the mountain, and the book says Moses entered the thick darkness where God was. The thick darkness, and it's a very strong word, eerie, overwhelming, total, absolute darkness where God is. That's the Holy of Holies. Any questions about that place? Yes.
Is this what's played out in Zechariah?
Yes.
Luke 1 enters 30 cents.
No, that's not in this place. That's in the holy place. For the first probably and only time in his life, he receives the lot, and he is deputized to burn incense in the morning burnt offering. And that comes in the second place. So you have the holy place there. Look at the room in front of the Holy of Holies. Now, this is, if you like, if you think in terms of a king, the Holy of Holies is the king's private quarters. The holy place is his office, his audience room, the place where he interacts not with the people, but with his officials. Now, the people, his private secretary, all the members of his cabinet, they are admitted to his office, his working room. So you have the working room there, which is God's audience room for the priests. You have the altar for incense, the lampstand, and the table for showbread. Now, the altar of incense, every morning, every evening, incense would be burnt on the altar before God. That's the focus of one part of the ritual, the burning of incense. In the morning, the priests would also trim the lamps. There's a menorah, 7 lampstand with 7 little lamps on it. You'd remove the ashes. You'd get the lampstand ready, because the lamps were lit and didn't burn during the day, but they burnt during the night. And the evening, then you'd light the lamps in connection with the rite when you burn the evening incense. And then you have the table of the showbread. It's a fairly small table, but on the table you have the round loaves, which are the bread of the presence. And you have 6 loaves, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 loaves, 2 piles of 6 loaves, 12 loaves of bread or flat bread representing the 12 tribes of Israel. They would stay there. They would be replaced every Sabbath, and they would be eaten by the priests on duty every Sabbath. So they'd stay there for a whole week. This is the Sabbath bread for the priests. most holy. And those three pieces of furniture, the table for the bread of the presence, the incense altar, and the menorah, the lampstand. Any questions on that? And then comes, for practical purposes, the most significant part, which is the altar for burnt offering with the laver. Okay, now, where does God meet with his people? He doesn't meet with them in the Holy of Holies. He doesn't even meet with the high priest in the Holy of Holies. The meeting point between God and his people is that altar. Notice the east-west axis. God comes from the Holy of Holies. The people come through the entrance. So they meet with God where? What's the meeting point? Is the altar for burnt offering. Hence that east-west axis. It's the place for public assembly and meeting. Now, notice the importance of public meeting. It's not as if God meets privately, only with a select few Israelites. God meets with whom?
All Israel.
All Israel. And it's open to all Israel twice every day. Just imagine what would happen if President Obama would meet with anybody he wanted to every day. That's the picture you have here. Here you have the King of the universe, the most high and holy God, who comes and meets with his people, not up in heaven. They don't have to go heavenly tripping. He comes down to earth and he meets with them publicly. Notice the corporate emphasis here. It's not with isolated individuals, but the whole congregation, the whole Eva, the whole assembly, the whole kahal.
Is that when the priest would read God's words at that when God meets his people?
No, only in the second temple and from the rabbis do we have account that there was any scripture reading. This is one of, and you need to realize that one of the big differences between temple and church is the importance of scripture reading and preaching. The only preaching that was done there was no preaching done in the tabernacle. The closest you get to preaching is the giving of the Aaronic benediction. In the temple that Solomon built, the choir did the preaching. And what were the sermons of the choir? The Psalms. They sang the Psalms. So they preached the Psalms and they prayed the Psalms and they used the Psalms to praise. Well, praise and preaching, praise about God, is in fact preaching of God, his name, his deeds, his gifts. Yes?
Just tying in with that, being a musician here, that's why oftentimes when I'm talking about the hymns, I talk about them as preaching. Also, Bach cantatas.
Bach cantatas, great, and that's the great Lutheran emphasis, and quite rightly so. And there's a lot of wonderful work done by Lutherans in the 17th century particularly, when they were challenged by the Calvinists about the use of musical instruments. They went back, not here, but they went to Chronicles. And they found the warrant for church music as well as the whole theology of worship, of praise, from the book of Chronicles. Now, if you're interested in that further, I did my doctoral thesis on that. Do you know my book, The Lord's Song?
Yes, I know that my brother in Christ.
Okay. There you have it. Yes. By the way, it's worth following this through because the big challenge we have everywhere, okay, for contemporary worship, what's contemporary worship basically about? Bands and praise singing. There's always an element of truth because what they emphasize is the importance of praise, and praise is important, but they get it completely wrong. And just fundamentally, it's this point where they get it wrong. If you look at the psalm, they emphasize praise as being adoration addressed to God. Most of the psalms of praise, we don't praise God face to face, adoration. There are some psalms of adoration, but praise is praising God not to God, but to each other and the world. It's proclamation. So praise is, in fact, one of the most powerful forms of proclamation imaginable. And that begins with Solomon, or David and Solomon, and at the temple in Jerusalem, and continues in the church to the present day, or it should continue. Praise. Yeah, I won't go any further because there's about a minute to go. Any other questions about the arrangement? Now, I'll talk about the significance of this arrangement and the purpose of this arrangement after lunch. But just, have you got your heads around very exactly what the arrangement is? Okay, you get those two courts, and you get the two main altars. Now, what's significant about that is that there are restricted places. See if you can work out, where do you reckon the ordinary Israelites would be allowed to go? Basically, free movement. Which space is open to the Israelites?
Courtyard.
Which part of the courtyard? Which courtyard? Not the inner courtyard, the outer courtyard. Up to where?
Altar.
Up to the altar. And there's only one time of year, which is the Feast of Tabernacles, where they actually go around the altar. So their access is to the altar and no further. In the temple, that was called the Court of the Israelites. Court of the Israelites. The outer court at the temple, there was another court outside there, was the court of the women, and there was another court outside of that which is called the Court of the Gentiles. So at the time of Jesus, the Herod's temple, you have two additional courts out further to the east. Okay, now, where would the Levites be allowed to go? The Levites, who are the workers, including the choir, where was the choir allowed to go in the temple? Where were the Levites, who were the choirmen, where were they allowed to go?
The outer court, the holy place.
Not the holy place.
Outer court behind the altar.
Sorry?
Outer court, but they got to go behind the altar.
They can go in the outer court, north and south of the altar, but they can't go in that axis from the altar to the Holy of Holies. Okay, they can go, you have these two courts here. Forgive the roughness of it. You have the entrance here, you've got this here, here. Israelites could go this space. This should go further here like this. Okay, Levites could go everywhere the Israelites went, and as well as this space out here. And they had to go out here to do the work that they were called to do. Why were they not allowed anywhere in this zone?
They weren't priests.
They weren't priests. And what was the status of this?
Most holy.
What's the status of this?
Most holy.
What's the status of this and this?
Most holy.
And if something's most holy, then it's accessible only to the priests. Well, then the most holy of all holy places is this place, which was only accessed, it could only be accessed by the high priest. Now notice here that you get zones of holiness. The closer you come to God, the holier you get. Or the more you participate in God's holiness, if you like to put it that way. And also then, if the important thing is that you don't desecrate God's holiness, in terms of the requirements for purity, ritual purity, who needed to observe the greatest degree of ritual purity and why? The high priest. Why? Because he went to that most holy place. After the priest, who had the lesser degree of purity? The priests, and then the Levites less, and the people the least. Can you see why? Because the people didn't actually come into contact with any of this stuff here. Therefore, the requirements for purity were far less stringent. So you get grades of holiness, but also in the reverse, you get grades of purity. All this is holy place, holy area. Okay, any questions on that before we go to lunch? Yes.
The people in the outer court, are they able to see into the holy place where the Levitical priests?
No.
That also is veiled
No,
off?
no. You can see that in the beginning of Luke. The people are outside. Zechariah is there burning the incense. The angel appears to him, and there's a hold up. They're waiting, they're praying. They haven't a clue what's happened to him. And finally he comes out, and they expect him to proceed. He may even have come out eventually and presented the burnt offering, but then he can't do the thing which is most important, which is to give the benediction. Okay, and that's when it's obvious that he's been struck dumb. It's interesting. Luke begins with a priest on duty who couldn't perform the Aaronic benediction, and it ends with Jesus, the high priest, entering the heavenly sanctuary to give, this is earthly blessing. An earthly priest who couldn't give an earthly blessing begins. The new high priest who enters heaven in order to give heavenly blessing to people on earth. So that's the bracketing of Luke's gospel. Let's have a break. Oh, it's all over the place.
No, instruments.
The what?
On instruments.
It's all over the place. Yes, it's all over the place.
The exegetes poo-poo it, but it's oftentimes better.
Oh, I'm not sure that here.
If it skirts anything would have been in the text. But thanks for this. I got to remember here, put it someplace where you absolutely do not forget. You think I'm kidding?
Sure.
Hey, Dwight, was addressing to children's again?
Oh, children's.
Probably
You know how to get your whole thing?
That's
Take 25 in a row. No, do this. Each take 25 in a row. 25 to 225, right?
Yeah.
And then exit a call path.
I-25.
Okay.
Commentary out, right? Somebody else.
There's a very interesting little touch which we find in Exodus 25. God doesn't just give Moses the words, the instructions about the building of the tabernacle, but he shows Moses the model of the tabernacle, and he shows Moses the model of the menorah, the lampstand, in heaven. So you get the idea here is that there is a heavenly prototype of which the tabernacle is an earthly model. So the real thing, the real temple, the real tabernacle, the real dwelling place of God is in heaven. And the earthly tabernacle is merely a model, a copy of the heavenly prototype. Now this is very important for a lot of patristic thinking about worship and a whole lot of other things. But this is where it comes from. God shows Moses the model of the heavenly tabernacle. Now, there's a lot of discussion then about what, is there a courtyard up there? Is there an altar? And you get very, very literalistic like that. But I don't think this is deliberately veiled in mystery. Okay? What exactly Moses saw, we don't know. What God showed Moses, we don't know, but we know that the tabernacle that was built in some ways approximates, reflects it, is modelled on it. And this is very important because otherwise you become too fixated on one particular building and absolutize that. And it becomes very difficult because we know that the tabernacle in the desert was modified when it was reconstructed or brought to Shiloh. Remember where Elijah was? And then it was destroyed there. So was the tabernacle at Shiloh exactly the same as in the desert? Well, it was different because whereas in the desert it was a portable building, but that portable building became a permanent building at Shiloh. It became not just a tabernacle, but the house of the Lord. And then if you look at the temple that Solomon constructs, it has the basic fundamental structure, but there's all sorts of things that are different. Now, does that mean that one is wrong, the other one's right? And then if you go further, then the data that we have is that at least some obvious ways, the temple that was built in the post-exilic period was different to the one in the pre-exilic period. In one very important respect it was so because there was no Ark of the Covenant, there was no mercy seat, there were no cherubim. The Holy of Holies was totally empty. And then, as I said before, when Herod extended the temple, rebuilt it in many ways, there were additions to it. There were 2 extra courts, and it became a very huge apparatus. And it had to be so to accommodate the thousands of people who'd come in pilgrimage. So what you have here given in Exodus is, if you like, a flexible outline, which is capable of being adapted and modified according to meet the needs and circumstances of people at different stages in Israel's history. Any questions on that? Yes?
I've been pondering something over sort of lunch hour and stuff. When Christ died on the cross in the temple, the curtain tore in the temple.
Yes.
You just indicated here there was nothing that was really concealing then, or?
Yes. It was God's glory was there, but there was no furniture there. And there's another story which is told that when the Romans finally entered the Acropolis in Jerusalem. The Acropolis was the fortress within the fortress. There's sort of layers of fortification. And the temple was the heart of the city, the Acropolis of Jerusalem. The Acropolis is the fortified fortress within the fortified city. The Jews defended it, and they were killed in thousands. And so the Romans thought, well, there must be immense treasure there. And since it's a temple, there must be an amazingly beautiful statue with gold and jewels. When finally they penetrated the temple and got there was a rush to get into the Holy of Holies, and they were disappointed because there was nothing within the room. It was an empty room. And the Romans therefore concluded that the Jews were atheists because they had no statue. So there was nothing there, no furniture there, but God was still present there in the darkness. So you need to understand that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess I was realizing today, I guess just that, obviously it was a big deal, but just the magnitude of that curtain.
It is simply stupendous. And by the way, there's some reference in the rabbis to the fact that the curtain was torn. And the theological implications of that is just enormous. But there's a lovely other parallel. There's 2 places where things are split. Beginning, say, Mark's Gospel, heaven was split open at the baptism of Jesus. Just as the curtain was split from top to bottom, and that 2-layered, by that time it was very, very thick, heavy, It was split from top to bottom, the same verb. Can you see the parallel? The baptism does what?
Opens heaven.
It opens heaven to the baptized person here on earth. And gives access to the heavenly sanctuary. Heaven's opened, the curtain is split at the death of Jesus, because we have a new and living way now, the new and living way, which is that holy way, into the most holy of holies, the heavenly sanctuary. Joel?
I'm still a little confused about when...
Good.
Well, I say it that way because I figure I shouldn't be. About when the only acceptable place to worship was Jerusalem. Because you mentioned Elijah and Shiloh, yes. And there seems to have been a certain amount of divine tolerance,
yes,
despite Jeroboam's
yes.
for
yes.
multiple other sites.
Now, right
or
from...
even I'm thinking of the temple in Egypt.
Yes. Okay, let's leave aside the temple in Egypt, because that's a special case. And what it actually was, we are not sure, scholars aren't sure of. So there's some question as to whether it in fact was a temple, or some basically like a synagogue arrangement. No, right from the beginning, God, if one of the most important things that we overlook when we read Exodus is that the places where God appears to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and what do? They build an altar. Now that means that a holy site is being established there. And it means that when the Israelites come into the land, these are places where there are altars. And legitimate altars, because God's appeared there. So the first principle is that there is not just one altar, but there are many altars. But you can't build an altar to the Lord except in the place where God has appeared. That's the first thing. Then, however, there is the phenomena of centralization. And you need to distinguish between two kinds of an altar. The most common altar is the old open-air altar with a precinct around it, open-air sanctuary. But the tabernacle and the temple at Shiloh and the temple at Jerusalem and then the temples at Bethel and Dan are different because they are not just an altar, but they have the two other things that are important for a temple, for this which is a temple. Now what's a temple? It's not a tent.
It's a house.
It's a house. It's a permanent building. A house of the Lord. And there is then, with that then, if you have a temple, a house, you need to have a permanent priesthood. Deuteronomy says, and it's a very important part of Deuteronomy, says, at the place you shall build an altar at the place which I choose, the place where I choose to place my name. And what's interesting there is the singular, the place. Now that is potentially ambiguous. It could be any place or one particular place. Now that's looking in the land. Now the history of Israel then from the temple onwards, now before I come to the temple, in Israel there was, right from the beginning when Solomon built the temple, at the place where the angel of the Lord appeared to David and was told to build an altar, so that's a legitimate altar, but it's the youngest of all the places of worship. And in ancient thinking, if something is young, it is a lower rank. And that the youngest place, the most recent place, should be the place where Solomon builds the temple, caused obviously, and you can get traces of this, obviously some unease amongst the priests who are attached and the people who worship at other shrines. Whether it's just altars or other places where there may have been temples. But from that point onwards, then gradually you get the centralization of worship at the one place in Jerusalem. And it's a very complicated thing, and it goes back and forward, but you need to read 1st and 2nd Kings to see that this is one of the main themes there. About the gradual centralization of worship. Where? Not in Bethel, not in Shiloh, not down in Hebron, all those are very ancient places, not down in Beersheba, but in Jerusalem. And the two most decisive times of this was Hezekiah, who shut down not all other temples, but shut down the open-air shrines, the altars. Why? Because they had been riddled with idolatry and syncretism. So they had become desecrated. Read the prophecies in Amos, and you can see there the judgment of God comes on these places. Why? Because they have desecrated, they've been involved in injustice and desecrated these holy places. So God is going to come in judgment and close down these shrines. And that happened one way with the Assyrians when they came down, and then part of the reform of Hezekiah is to shut down these shrines. And then the second stage of the reform comes after the reign of Manasseh, when Josiah's on the throne. These are not only shut down, but the decree is given that no one can worship in any place but Jerusalem, which caused a great deal of unrest. And you can see when you read Jeremiah and other contemporaries, you can see that this caused some problem. However, it was still open-ended by the time the exile came. When the Babylonians came, there was no temple, no shrine left in the land. After the exile, there was only one altar that was built in Jerusalem, and there was only one temple in Jerusalem. And from that point onwards, this was the only place. So there's a long process in which, if you like, Deuteronomy, in its stricter sense, was gradually being implemented. We need to distinguish between two things. There's divine institution, and then there's the implementation of divine institution. And the history of Israel is that, the way they read the Pentateuch is that in no sense was the divine institution in the Pentateuch ever fully and perfectly implemented. There was some claim that it was perfectly implemented in the post-exilic period, but even that was disputed. Yes?
Okay. This raises a question for me. If it wasn't perfectly implemented, with what confidence could they go about?
Okay, the confidence is the same as our confidence that it was divinely instituted. Some parts couldn't be implemented because there's certain, and I can't go, there's some bits of legislation which say, when you enter the land, then. Okay? In Deuteronomy it says that the people are to, in the Passover, was to be brought to one single place. That becomes, obviously that's only practicable when they come in the land, and even when they come in the land, what happens to people who live 200 or 300 miles from Jerusalem? Okay, there's an actual record in Chronicles saying that part of it was only implemented for practical reasons at the time of Josiah, and that was because the dimensions of the kingdom had shrunk to such extent that it became feasible. Back to your question, where does the confidence lie? And this is important for me. If I had to wait for the perfect implementation of those things that are divinely instituted, or even what I am convinced is divinely instituted in any concrete liturgy, and not just the liturgy, but and that's one thing, you can have the liturgical order, but there's a big slip between the liturgical order and the implementation of it Sunday by Sunday by the priest or the pastor. If my confidence was in the perfect performance of it, my faith would be on very slender on very precarious ground. My confidence is on the divine institution of these things and the Word, even where it's not perfectly, and I know in many cases, and I've attended many communion services where I'm horrified at the carelessness of the pastors with holy things and how little they regard what has been divinely instituted. It's not that they've done anything that's forbidden, but they've just not done it in the fullest possible way. So, for me, this emphasis that I've been giving on the Word has a very practical, pastoral dimension to it. That's my security. That's the basis of my confidence in coming to Holy Communion. And that's why I can come to Holy Communion with a good conscience rather than a bad conscience. Let me flip that around. However, under no circumstances would I take communion at a perfect liturgy, which is respect in every way in a Lutheran church, a confessional Lutheran church where you have a woman pastor. It's perfect liturgically. What's the problem? The wrong person. And how do we know the wrong person? Because Scripture itself forbids women to be pastors, teachers, preachers. So that's forbidden. And then I'd have no confidence that when I'd come to communion, do I receive the body and blood of Jesus? Yeah, probably. But I don't receive it for my blessing. It's valid. No, it's efficacious, maybe, and I can be uncertain about that, but it's definitely not valid. And therefore, there's uncertainty of conscience. And the whole purpose of the divine service is to deliver a good conscience to people. And it undermines that basic, fundamental purpose of every act of divine service. I've taken some time, do you mind? Because I find that this is so important for me personally. And it's very important for pastors in a situation where you get a liturgical carelessness. I was going to say disorder, but that's maybe too dramatic.
Well, on one hand, and the liturgical Nazis on the other.
Yeah, that's the other thing. And the liturgical Nazis who major in minors. And everything's of equal value then. You know, that you cross yourself here or you bow here, little things like that. Now, they're good customs. I love them. But to make them essential is to burden consciences. So you burden consciences either way. Burden consciences by treating adiaphora as if they are essential. You burden consciences when you don't fully enact that which is divinely instituted. By the way, those distinctions, divinely instituted mandates, prohibitiva, adiaphora, all focus on the delivery of a good conscience. That's the intention of those categories that we've inherited from the Reformation. Yes, ma'am?
With women's ordination, wouldn't that go to the wrong, or going back to your discussion on Monday morning, right ordering or institution? So women's ordination attacks the institution of God.
Yes, the order.
Yeah, the order.
The order. Okay, I have a little thumb rule for the interpretation of ritual, to make sense of ritual. I give it to you for your interest. And I'll exemplify it. Okay, let's say something like Holy Communion. The question I ask is, who does what to or with whom, where, when, with what, and by what authority. Okay, let's go Holy Communion. What has God instituted about Holy Communion as far as who does this in remembrance of me? Who has responsibility for the doing of it? The church is not general. No, the church hasn't got responsibility. It belongs to the church, but the church doesn't administer the sacrament. Just as even though the government, the presidency belongs to the citizens of the USA, the citizens don't exercise the presidency. Who does communion?
To perform this speech acts with the pastor.
With the pastor. And that's the whole business of the Amt. It's the Christ has not just instituted the sacrament and given it to the church and say anybody can do it. He's given it to the ministry. The office of ministry, the ministry of word and sacrament is divinely instituted. Is it divinely instituted? Yes. That's what our confessions say. Who does what? An ordained person. The right person needs to do it. And that there's questions then about, okay, who is the right person? And does it mean that a person's ordained this way? Or, how do we determine who? That's a different question. But it must be a person in the office of ministry. Does what? Holy Communion. To or with whom? Who is Holy Communion for?
The people.
Which people?
Christian.
Which Christians?
Baptized.
Repentant. We're forgetting that. Baptized, repentant people. You could say baptized, absolved. I'd rather put it absolved people, because the absolution, we see absolution disconnected from Holy Communion. But the old understanding of absolution is that absolution admits you to Holy Communion. So whenever I absolve a person, I'm admitting to communion. If I refuse to absolve a person, if I retain the sin, I'm excluding them from communion. So absolution and Holy Communion go together, like horse and carriage. Once again, something that we've lost. That's its proper place. Disconnect it from the Lord's Supper, or then you go into trouble. Get into trouble. So who does what? To whom? Baptized, confessing, Lutherans would say. Baptized, confessing, absolved members of the congregation. As they say, members of the congregation. That's an important part of your polity, and Lutheran polity. Where is communion to be done?